Okay, so now we're going to talk about multiple realizability. Okay, so if your system is medium independent and there are several formally equivalent ways of instantiating it, then it's what we call multiply realizable, right? So multiple realizability occurs when a system, mental state, or mental event can be realized by different physical states. And this is one way to get multiple realizability with medium independence. And here there are other ways, oh, sorry, there are other ways you can get multiple realizability without a formal system, but formal systems are often multiply realizable. So this is one of the convenient characteristics about assuming that the mind is a formal system or made of a formal system, because if it is, then it's multiply realizable and therefore AI or hard AI or strong artificial intelligence, genuine artificial intelligence is therefore possible. Um, so being multiply realizable is like the same phenomena with different physical matter. So this is kind of a weird slide, but like if P1 is how the human mind is when we're not in a physical or we're not in a state of pain, and then when we get into a painful state, then the physical matter is realized with P4, whatever that might be. Okay. And so if we had an octopus, right, who is not in pain, right, that state is physically realized by whatever P2 is. And then when they get into a pain state, then it's physically realized by whatever P5 is. Um, yeah. So the point here is that being in the same state can be physically realized in different ways, excuse me. Okay. So if your system is if your system is medium independent and there are several formally equivalent ways of instantiating it, then it is multiply realizable. Some functions and or states can be physically accomplished in different ways. Uh, for example, a digital thermometer, where you put the tip of the thermometer uh, under your tongue, right? You can accomplish the same thing with this type of temperature reader, right? So you could say that this function of taking the temperature is multiply realizable. And the same goes with time, right? There's multiple ways to realize or represent time. And so, yeah, and so this is true. If this is true that the system is medium independent and there are several formally equivalent ways of instantiating it, then it's multiply realizable. In this case, all we would have to do is figure out how the system works and we could replicate it in a different way in a different medium. So if you've ever seen Black Mirror, you find this. There's an episode where this woman right here, this older woman, she's dying. And in the episode, what they do is they can they could download the data of that person and then upload it to a simulated reality with other people who have also downloaded and their data and uploaded it into this simulated reality. So, this woman, she's downloaded her data, uploaded it to this simulated reality, and now she's a young woman, and she's having the time of her life, even though her physical body is gone or decaying. So this is actually an example of multiple realizability in science fiction. Another, I think, this is also true with carbon, if you've ever watched that. So I think the idea is that like data from one person can get downloaded and uploaded into another person. And again, this would be multiple realizability. And a lot of science fiction depends on the concept of multiple realizability. Um, but we don't have to go into science fiction. It could just be that the human is like a mind, right? The human mind is like a mind. The computer has a mind, right? The humans have a mind, computers have a mind, and aliens even have a mind, right? And if that's the case, right, if we're a formal system, then this would be multiple realizability as well. And this is similar to the view that mental states are not just physical states, but the functioning or operation of those physical states. So we can talk about things being different because of what they're made of, whether it's silicon or neurons. Um, if we talk about a carpet is different from a jellyfish because they're made of different substances. Okay, that's one way to classify things, but we can also classify things based on their function. So automobiles would all fall under the same category because they all functionally do the same thing. They transport goods and people. So the idea behind functionalism is that we can identify the mind not based on the substance that it's made of, but by the functions that they perform. So it could be, if we had artificial intelligence, we could say that the rules of the mind can be instantiated on a computer. And so, even though a computer is made of different material than what humans are made of, we would say that the rules of the mind are still multiply realizable. And this is consistent with functionalism, right? We would classify the human mind as similar to a computer mind, if in fact we had genuine artificial intelligence. And I've said this already at one point, but I'll say it again. Pure artificial intelligence, right? Strong artificial intelligence is not possible unless intelligence is multiply realizable. And again, multiple realizability can occur in other systems that are not formal, but most formal systems are multiply realizable. So if our mind is a formal system or operates as a formal system like a computer does, then it should be possible in principle to create artificial intelligence. And once we figure out how the mind works in its entirety, once we figure out how natural intelligence once we figure out natural intelligence, then we should be able to build artificial intelligence. Yeah, I already said this, but it's probably a good time to mention that again, that the idea that our minds are formal systems that behave according to the rules of logic, this idea doesn't mean that we're all unemotional and completely logical, right? This does not mean that we would all be like Data from Star Trek. Um, we can use a we can use a logical system to make something that is illogical or emotional, right? So just because we're made of logic in a sense doesn't mean that we have to be logical all the time or unemotional all the time. Okay, and this is the sort of disciplinary hope, as I've mentioned before, right? Just like there's hardware of a computer and then there's software that determines the rules and how it functions. The idea is that the brain, which is kind of like hardware, and then the mind is kind of like software. So, as I alluded to before, this clear distinction between software and hardware was an important guiding assumption for the first wave of cognitive science. It's similar to how we don't need to study the hardware of a computer in order to understand how Microsoft Office works, or vice versa. And this distinction is important because it makes it possible to study the mind without studying the brain, without needing to study the brain. Uh, right. So I'll say it again. This distinction is important because it makes it possible to study the mind without needing to study the brain. Of course, this doesn't mean that knowing about the hardware is completely irrelevant. Knowing about the brain is completely irrelevant and cannot help. The point is just that the knowledge about how the hardware works is not necessary. For example, knowing what the storage and processing limitations are of a computer might give you an idea about how much processing power Microsoft Office may need, which may constrain the possibilities of how Microsoft Office works, but it's not at all required. That's the point. Um, yeah. So, what else did I want to say? You can understand the rules of the mind without knowing how they are physically implemented. Similarly, this distinction implies that neuroscience can never replace psychology because minds would not be reducible to brain activity if it's multiply realizable. As I mentioned, you could view the distinction between hardware and software as sort of a middle ground between the idea that we are simply meat machines and that we're also more than meat machines, right? The Descartes view versus the Hobbes view. And this sort of idea that the mind is separate from the brain and, independent, or not independent, but the idea that they can be studied separately, um, is kind of a middle ground of those two extreme views of Hobbes and Descartes, right? So the way the mind works is determined by our brain, of course. So in that sense, we are meat machines. However, going back to the slide of about Hobbes and Descartes, you might say that Descartes had a point when he said that we are more than meat machines. So although the mind is not material like a soul, the distinction between the mind and brain is important because the mind is not reducible to brain activity. Just as the explanation of how software works is not reducible to hardware. Okay, so that went a little long, sorry. The next videos we're going to talk about language of thought hypothesis.